Ladies and gentlemen, the plenary session is now starting.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming. It's a pleasure and an honor to welcome you today for this important plenary session on the occasion of the ICOM General Conference. In the past year, you all remember the damages caused by the fire in Notre Dame, and the fires in Notre Dame and Rio shocked the world, and the public outcry, the following public outcry demonstrated the urgent need to make cultural property protection a priority, not only for us as museum curators and conservators. As the leader of the global ICOM community, ICOM is dedicated to the protection of cultural heritage in danger and leads an integrated approach that implies assessment, preparedness, and response. With its specialized committees, especially with the Disaster Risk Management Committee that has organized this session together with the Heritage Protection Department of ICOM, and with the future, International Committee on Disaster Resilient Museums, ICOM is offering knowledge and know-how for the implementation of standards and techniques in the area of risk management, emergency plans, professional networking, and public awareness raising. Therefore, at a time when we are all witnessing an increased level of destruction and damage to cultural property around the world, our commitment and our cooperation are crucial to preserve it in its entirety for future generations. More than ever, heritage protection is an urgency. The RMC plays a key role in gathering world-renowned experts in the field and providing a forum to share experiences, as well as discussing the challenges and threats that museums are facing. Corinne Wegener, as chair, has essentially contributed to this role of the RMC. Let me express my gratitude for your dedication, Corinne, to the protection of heritage around the world and for your commitment to ICOM. I would also like to thank the other members of the outgoing standing committee for the activities developed in the last 3 years, and of course the participants of the discussion today, Alejandra Peña Gutierrez, Renata Motta, wrong order, Renata Motta, Alejandra Peña Gutierrez, Aparna Tandon, and Yuichi Ono, from the left to the right. I want also to thank my team, Sophie Del Pierre, Carlos, Elsa, Ludovica, for organizing, supporting this session, and thank you for attending this conference and this plenary in particular. I wish you all the best for your discussions. And before I finish, something completely different. Don't forget to vote for the elections, because we have a quite low participation until now. The elections office is number 104. It's on this floor if you leave the main hall to the left in the direction of the museum fair. Sorry, Corinne, for this interference. And all the best for the discussions. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Peter, Director General of ICOM, Soe Aksoy, President of ICOM, members of the Executive Board, members of the national and international committees, and distinguished guests. Our topic today is a serious one. Since our triennial meeting in Milan, we've witnessed continued damage to museums from natural and human-caused hazards, including armed conflict. Our topic today is perfectly placed in Japan, which is famous for its technological advances in disaster risk reduction, as well as being the home of the 2015 Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. As Peter mentioned, I'm Corey Wegener. I'm the immediate past chair of the ICOM Disaster Risk Management Committee, a standing committee of ICOM, and the director of the Smithsonian Cultural Rescue Initiative, and I think I'd be remiss if I didn't say also a member of ICOM US. As for the tasks of the ICOM Disaster Risk Management Committee, we've been advising the ICOM Secretariat for many years since our standing up in 2005. And we've done a few programs around the world. To include, on August 31st, we held a pre-conference workshop at the Kyoto National Museum titled Are You Ready? An Introduction to Disaster Risk Management for Museum Professionals. We had about 45 participants and a number of observers, so it was a really wonderful time, and I think we all learned a lot from one another, and I'd like to thank the Kyoto National Museum again and its staff for hosting us and taking care of all the logistics. Yesterday, the Disaster Risk Management Committee, a standing committee, transformed into the new International Committee for Disaster Resilient Museums, also still ICOM DRMC. I'd like to thank all of the past DRMC Standing Committee members who have served since 2005, with a special thanks to Dr. Thomas Schuler, our colleague who started the DRMC back in 2005. I'd also like to briefly mention our new ICOM DRMC board officers. They will be Diana Pardue from ICOM US as the new chair, Ihor Poshevailo from ICOM Ukraine as vice chair, Dr. Brian Daniels from ICOM US as secretary, and Yuji Kurihara from ICOM Japan as treasurer. We'll be electing additional ordinary board members in the next meeting in early 2020. If you're interested in joining the new ICOM IC on disaster resilient museums, watch for your renewal, and it will become one of the international committees that you can check. If you want to stay with your current international committee, that's okay. But you're welcome to join us for any of our programming. Our goals are to work on integrating disaster resilience as a cross-cutting theme throughout ICOM's national and international committees, and to do outreach to the larger disaster risk management professional community. In short, to make disaster risk thinking part of all of our activities. We also plan to better address the issue of museums and cultural institutions facing armed conflict. ICOM was created in part after World War II to address the recovery of museums. ICOM is mentioned in the 1999 Protocol to the 1954 Hague Convention for the Protection of Cultural Property in the event of armed conflict, and so has important responsibilities under this Law of War Treaty. ICOM is also a founding member of Blue Shield International, the NGO created to help support and implement the Hague Convention. ICOM DRMC also plans to increase support and access to ICOM for museum colleagues in countries experiencing armed conflict and other types of hazards, so that their voices and experiences can be heard in our forums. So, without further ado, Peter already mentioned our speakers, but just briefly, I'll introduce them just by their titles. You have a long information and bio about each of the speakers, both on the app, on the ICOM app, as well as in the ICOM program. So I won't waste our time by introducing all the fabulous expertise of each of our speakers, and I will mention them all here now, and then they'll come up one after the other and speak. And then we're trying to leave a good deal of time for discussion as well as audience participation in this forum. Renata Vieira da Mota is chair of ICOM Brazil, who will speak first. Alejandra Peña Gutierrez is the executive director of the Museo Arte de Ponce from Puerto Rico in the US. Aparna Tandon is project manager for ICROM in Rome, Italy. And Professor Yuichi Ono is professor at Tohoku University, who will end our session by talking about disaster risk reduction. So to start us off, Renata.
Good morning. I would like to greet my panel colleagues and to thank the organization for the invitation to attend this plenary session. It's been 1 year since the National Museum in Rio de Janeiro was on fire. I'd like to share some information about the actions taken with the ICOM community and also to reflect on the challenges to reduce the disaster risk of our cultural heritage. Before starting, I would like to mention the presence of Mr. Paulo Amaral, President of the Brazilian Institute of Museums, IBRAM, the highest Brazilian authority in the museum sector here. IBRAM plays an important role in defining policies and implementing actions related to disaster risk management in Brazil. Mr. Amaral. Yesterday, Sebastião Salgado presented us his vision of the Amazon forest. His work speaks of sustainability, but mostly of a culture based on a deep relationship with nature, in its full beauty and diversity. However, as you know, we are now, as professionals, in constant alert, following the threats and shaken by the challenges of the preservation of Brazil's natural history. The sense of stability and challenging reminds us of the most important tragedy of the Brazilian museum sector. In the same year of its 200th anniversary celebration, our oldest museum was devastated by a fire that destroyed its headquarters. Brazil and the international community fell silent, facing the scale of the loss of this very important Brazilian collection. ICOM community reacted immediately with great sense of solidarity and a generous offer of technical and material support. We'd like to sincerely thank President Suai Aksoy, Director General Peter Keller, and the entire ICOM community for your meaningful support and solidarity. I would like to share with you the actions taken by the National Museum as well as the ones implemented by ICOM Brazil in the aftermath. During this conference, you also have the opportunity to hear tomorrow at the ICEE meeting the future plans presented by the director of the museum, Dr. Alexander Kellner himself. And yesterday, Claudia Carvalho, former director of the museum, now in charge of the rescue activities, made her presentation at the Universal Museums International Committee, UMAC, session. If you want to have more information or to establish any kind of cooperation, I highly recommend you to look for them during the conference. The National Museum fire occurred on Sunday, September 2nd, 2018, and the first actions to rescue the collection were carried out under the shock without clear coordination by professors, researchers, and professionals of the institution. Later on, a strategic plan was built in two fronts. The first one to rescue the collections, with the setting up of labs and storage, and also the engagement of the museum teams for the recovery activities that would take place in the following months. The second front act in the aftermath was the area protection and the stabilization of the building. The National Museum is a university museum linked to the University of Rio de Janeiro under the federal government. Given the scale of the tragedy, between the shock and the bureaucracy of the public sector, it should be highlighted the challenge to establish a clear governance and the difficulties to receive all the offered aid. Immediately after the fire, ICOM Brazil contacted the direction of the National Museum, indicating the technical availability of the international community of ICOM professionals. In the 2 months following the fire, September and October last year, ICOM Brazil followed from close the work. The main actions articulated with ICOM community were, in September, the meeting of the Minister of Education of Brazil with the Director General Peter Keller in Paris to discuss possible ways ICOM could cooperate with the National Museum. In October, Deputy Director of National Museum, Cristiana Cerejo, attended the CEDOC annual conference in Crete, A discussion took place around the role of documentation in general in relation to fire events and in regard to proposals for pragmatic action that could be taken under the aegis of CDOC to be serviced in this situation. In November, General Director Peter Keller's mission to Rio de Janeiro took place with site visits and meetings with the museum's director. After the emergence actions, ICOM Brazil discussed the next steps within our board. In the proposed 3-year plan from 18 to 21, the topic disaster risk management, I must say, was not highlighted by that time. Given the magnitude of these laws, we decided to review the plan, including as a priority actions related to disaster risk management. In December 18, with the support of ICOM LAC and ICRON, we applied for ICOM SAREX grant to develop an international seminar and a workshop focused on the subject. The international seminar, Heritage on Fire, Who's Next?, took place in Rio from 26 to 28 June this year in partnership with IBRAM and ICRON. I'm grateful to Vera Mangas, my colleague, and the Vice President of ICOM Brazil, and also to José Luiz Pedersoli Jr. from ICRON for their great collaboration. The seminar brought together 17 specialists from 7 countries, covering a broad range of fields and disciplines. In addition to the panels, a forum of experts took place in Rio de Janeiro on the last day of the seminar. This qualified group proposed a list of recommendations, the Rio de Janeiro Declaration on Fire Risk Reduction in Cultural Heritage, that will soon be released. The document intends to be an international guidance tool considering the lack of robust policies and legal instruments for the protection of cultural heritage against fire. At the seminar, ICOM was honorably represented by Vice President Dr. Lai Chun-an. The audience was twice as big as expected, with the participation of over 500 professionals and authorities. The contribution of the speakers were of high technical level, provide a significant overview of fire risk management around the world. A key point of the seminar was to point out that first, fire represents a high risk, but not necessarily a major impact. A significant number of accidents can be prevented by proper maintenance and safety measures. The meeting raised the awareness on the needs of the development of a culture of prevention for fire risk. In the seminar, José Luiz Pedersoli also drew attention to the need of the improvement of fire statistics, information on how fire starts, how often, what causes, and what origins. All that data should be systematically collected for effective risk analysis and risk mitigation. In the case of the National Museum, it's worth mentioning that the National Museum fire had a quite usual cause. It started with an electric failure of the air conditioner on the ground floor of the building. In this presentation, Pedersoli also offered us this group of fire events in Brazil and around the world, include the recent Notre Dame of Paris fire. These images are emblematic of the high risk of fire and the urgent need for prioritization and prevention in order to mitigate the losses in our heritage. Professor Kenner's lecture at the ICE session tomorrow will provide an up-to-date and detailed overview of the current moment and the next steps of the National Museum. In general, the building is stabilized and protected by the temporary roof you see in the left image. Around $250,000 were invested in the facade stabilization works and $2.5 million in the roof, this temporary roof. An agreement has been established with UNESCO that will be responsible for the development of the architecture project for facades and roof, with $17.5 million available until now. The museum also received 230,000 euros from the German government and around $7,000 from the local community donated to the Museums Association. As Claudia Carvalho mentioned in her presentation yesterday, work on the debris and recovery of the collection is also advanced. Most of the work is completed with 71 clean rooms. The remaining 15 rooms will be completed until the beginning of next year. The exhibition spaces were devastated, but the storage located on the ground floor at the back of the palace was to a certain degree preserved. So far, more than 4,000 items have been recovered. As a university museum, with an emphasis in research, there is an important focus on the loss of the collections. It's now under discussion, the guidelines and premises for the establishment of a policy for a new possible collection. To end my presentation, I return to Sebastião Salgado's special view from the Amazon forest, hoping that we can make the road a safe and resilient place for our natural and cultural heritage. Thank you.
Good morning to all. Buenos días a todos. Bonjour à tous. Ohayo gozaimasu, Kyoto. I am here to talk about the museum experience in Puerto Rico after the stroke of the devastating hurricanes Irma and Maria, and in particular about how we overcame the disaster at the Museo de Arte de Ponce. Puerto Rico, officially the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico, is an island territory of the United States located in the northeast of the Caribbean Sea. Puerto Rico is somewhat unique in its relationship with the United States. Even if Puerto Ricans are U.S. citizens, they cannot vote in the U.S. presidential elections. For over a decade, the island has been struggling through a major economic recession. Between the years 2006 and 2016, Puerto Rico's economy shrank by nearly 16%, and its public debt reached more than $73 billion. The population decreased by 10.6% due to emigration, and almost half of its residents had already lived under the poverty rate before the hit of the hurricanes. The population is aging, and an increasing number of young people and working-age adults have migrated from the island. Late in the night of September 6, 2017, the southern eyewall of Hurricane Irma passed north of San Juan, leaving 1 million people without power. Less than 2 weeks later, the morning of Wednesday, September 20, Hurricane Maria struck Puerto Rico as a massive Category 4 storm, devastating the island and leaving its 3.4 million residents into what soon became a humanitarian crisis. Maria was a slightly smaller storm than Irma, but it was far more devastating. Near its peak intensity, it charted a course directly across Puerto Rico. The powerful Category 4 storm plowed across the island with sustained winds of 155 miles per hour, massively destroying all infrastructure and the island's natural resources. Maria destroyed homes, roads, bridges, knocked out power across the entire island, and triggered heavy flooding. The storm knocked out 1,360 of the 1,600 cell phone towers on the island. Many communities were isolated from the outside world for 4 weeks or more, relying on the radio for news. The National Guard, as well as the police and other law enforcement agencies, were seriously struggling to communicate on the ground, making their ability to respond even harder. The Guardian reported almost 1 month after the hit of the storm that officials from the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, were concerned about the huge food shortage on the island. The storm left thousands of families without a home, and some communities were entirely destroyed. The original death count of 64 people raised to 2,975 people in August of 2018, according to the Puerto Rican government. However, the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health published a study that estimates the death of 4,645 people as a result of health complications during the aftermath of the hurricanes. Hurricanes Irma and Maria disrupted the lives of 350,000 public school students. It took nearly 5 weeks before the first public schools began to reopen, and most of them, while open, were still operating without power. About 1 in every 13 students left the island after Maria hit. 42,000 kids vanished from the school rolls after the storm. During the weeks following the storms, some airlines reported that they had over 20,000 passengers on waiting lists. Over 200,000 people left the island. It's estimated that half of the people that left are under the age of 24 years. As of 2015, Puerto Rico had already lost 1 doctor every day. The scale of Maria's destruction was devastating, causing $94.4 billion in damage. For months, most families and businesses remained without power and limited cell phone service, while clear water, food, medicines, cash, and fuel were all in very short supply. These major problems would have made life difficult even in an intact house for the weeks and months to come. On average, households in Puerto Rico went 84 days without power, 68 days without water, and 41 days without cell service. Such devastating events are a reminder of the importance of preparing for a disaster. The morning after the hit of Hurricane Maria, once the neighbors helped me make my way out of the museum, I drove over to the Museo de Arte de Ponce without really knowing what to expect. Even if the surroundings were in pretty bad shape, the interior of the museum had been left intact by the storm. And I decided at that moment that we had to reopen our doors as soon as possible to be able to share that little piece of normalcy with our community. But little did we know of the complications we were going to encounter. Our most immediate problem was a lack of any kind of communication. Not only did we ignore what was really happening around us, since our only source of news was a battery-operated radio with only 1 station transmitting. Soon the issue became how to get in touch with our staff to know if they were safe and could come help, how to get in touch with our vendors. Very soon our worries escalated to fuel and our utter dependence to keep our generator working in order not only to preserve our collection, but also open our doors to our community. Fuel becomes a precious thing under circumstances like this, just as many other things we take for granted every day. I soon learned that museums are way below the food chain when disaster relief institutions take over the distribution of diesel. Nevertheless, after embarking in an adventure that could have been taken out of a Mad Max movie, along with my curator and his Fiat Cinquecento, we were able to guarantee the 4,000 gallons of diesel to keep our generator going for 4 days at a time, along with a well-kept promise to keep the fuel coming while the power outage lasted. After communicating with our staff, mainly through the local radio station, writings on the museum doors and post-its right next to them, a part of our staff gathered to organize the work that needed to be done in order to reopen the museum. I am very proud to say that thanks to the joint effort of our team, we managed to reopen the doors of our museum only 1 week after the hit of Hurricane Maria. The museum was the first institution to open its doors to the public and offer free entrance to all visitors until the month of November. The museum also joined the Ricky Martin Foundation and the Sports and Recreation Department in an island-wide initiative to visit all municipalities and provide workshops at no cost. Other museums, especially in San Juan, also did an important service to their communities. A good example of support to other institutions was the effort the Museo de Arte de Puerto Rico made to become a shelter for the works of collections that were at risk in the area. Thanks to a grant from the Smithsonian Institution, they were able to provide temporary storage to 100 works from other collections. The museum also organized a series of workshops on heritage emergency and response training with the support of HEMA's Heritage Emergency Task Force and the Smithsonian Cultural Rescue Initiative. ICOM ICE also made a contribution to the Museo de Arte de Puerto Rico to help cover their diesel expenses. At the end, ours was a story with a happy ending, but I encourage every single one of you here to be paranoid and think of all that could go wrong in the event of a disaster in your museum. We depend too much on technology, we depend too much on our modern way of life and communication. I can tell you we had a well-designed disaster plan, but we were not prepared for the aftermath of such a devastating event. Make your team aware of the importance your institution holds within your community. You are without doubt a milestone. If they see you rise, it will give them hope and strength to rise too. Your success will depend on your ability to guide your team through this, understanding they too are suffering, probably way more than you are. They have problems and concerns of their own, and as you, they are putting all aside for a greater good, that of your community. Do all that is in your hands to make the lives of your staff easier. Think of the resources you might have available and could make a difference on the everyday struggle to survive under these extraordinary circumstances. Power, cash, ice, drinking water, fuel, showers, even time off when food finally gets to a local supermarket. You might have a disaster preparedness plan in place, but you will have nothing if you do not have a team to support your efforts. And no one can go through this alone. Arigato gozaimasu.
Good morning, and thank you to my previous speaker for such an inspiring talk. You have made my task easier. Imagine that you have, as a museum, just prepared a disaster preparedness plan or an emergency response plan, whatever you choose to call it, for your museum, and have identified the space in front of your museum, like the one that you can see on the picture, as the ideal space for setting up base of emergency operations in case of an emergency. But then you discover that in the event of a large-scale emergency, you will not have control over the use of that space or even your building. What would be your reaction? This is not a fictitious scenario. At a workshop organized by ICOM and the Irish National Blue Shield Committee aimed at fostering interagency, cooperation, and coordination, the staff of the National Museum of Colin Barracks found out that the open space that the museum was counting on for using in the event of an emergency would be used by the Irish Civil Protection to provide emergency shelters in case entire Dublin is flooded. As has been highlighted by the previous speaker, and as also mentioned in the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, heritage has a great potential to build disaster resilience. It is a source for traditional knowledge, for adapting to a changing climate, and for reducing disaster risk and coping with disasters. It's a source of livelihoods. It can build social cohesion, and it provides a thread of continuity as we have seen in the previous example, to people who are affected. Yet, we are not able to harness this potential fully until now. Oops, sorry. This is because heritage institutions and museums are not connected to their local and national disaster risk management systems. Therefore, when a large-scale disaster strikes, heritage is not seen as a priority, and there is no funding for cultural first aid. As a result, when there is a large-scale disaster, local emergency management authority takes charge, and in absence of prior coordination, access to heritage is restricted. Heritage structures and objects tend to get damaged in hasty cleanups, and emergency funds made available, as I mentioned before, by local governments do not support cultural heritage first aid, which as a result remains donor-driven and at best ad hoc. Why should this matter? We all know that disasters are becoming more frequent. In 2018, 281 extreme weather events directly affected 60 billion people. Conflicts have been equally devastating. According to a recent study, collectively we have lost infrastructure worth $14 trillion. And now there is an increasing interaction between conflicts and disasters. That is, countries that suffer from prolonged cycles of violence and civil unrest are more vulnerable to disasters. We have seen this in Haiti, in Nepal, Myanmar, and Yemen. Therefore, as mentioned yesterday also, our focus should be now on building disaster resilience through integrated strategies that help to enhance coping capacities, reduce vulnerabilities, assist in adapting to a changing climate, and at the same time, transform existing tensions and conflicts. Heritage has a role to play. But it will require setting up of an ecosystem, intersectorial coordination and cooperation between heritage, disaster risk management, and humanitarian assistance lies at the heart of such an ecosystem. This cooperation and coordination in turn depends on robust cross-institutional networks that organizations such as ICOM can help foster. And the institutional networks will in turn depend on trained and empowered volunteers drawn from local communities living in risk-prone regions. Developing such an ecosystem requires capacity building at all levels. Now I will explain how ICOM, through its flagship program on disaster risk first aid and resilience, is trying to contribute to the development of such an ecosystem and also implement the actions and priorities outlined in the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction. As a first step, ICOM has joined hands with UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs and UNESCO to include a module of cultural heritage first aid in all international search and rescue operations with the aim to enhance interagency coordination and coping capacities within the heritage sector in the immediate response phase. In 2019, we are organizing joint simulations. We have just concluded one in Turkey, one in Sicily. And following that, in 2020, UN will release official guidelines which will make it mandatory for all international search and rescue teams to include a module of cultural heritage first aid in their responses. In order to standardize response and seek better integration with the humanitarian sector, ICOM is working with European Civil Protection Agency and humanitarian aid operations to develop common method and standard operating procedures which will be implemented in all 31 countries participating in the European Civil Protection Mechanism, and hopefully also in the overseas operations carried out by the European Civil Protection Agency. Targeted at mainstream emergency actors, cultural heritage professionals, and community-based organizations, ICOM has developed some field-tested guidance and self-help online tools, which have been translated into more than 10 languages, thanks to the support of several ICOM national committees listed here, and also National Museum of Kyoto, and I wanted to thank them personally. To better understand damage and loss caused to cultural heritage in a given situation, emergency situation, ICOM has developed a simple open source app which helps communities to provide real-time information. This app was deployed in Nepal and in Kerala in 2018, following the floods there in India, where data collected was used to inform post-disaster needs assessment carried out by the local governments and the United Nations. We have also developed a mapping tool for carrying out community-based risk assessments for cultural heritage. It will be released online next month and has been field tested in the winemaking region of Georgia. But we invite community museums to use this tool and give us their feedback. In collaboration with partners such as the Smithsonian Institution, ICOM also provides in-depth professional training and structured follow-up for prevention, preparedness, response, and recovery of all types of heritage. We have trained over 500 professionals in 78 countries. Some of them are active members of ICOM and lead its various national or regional committees. And also now there are some people in the board of the newly formed international DRMC, for which we are very pleased. And many of them are here in this conference. Access to cultural heritage is a human right. Its protection is crucial for building peace and resilience. But this won't be possible without coordination and cooperation within and beyond the heritage sector. Therefore, the time is now. We have to act, and we have to act together, because culture cannot wait. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good morning, all. My name is Yuichi Ono. I guess my role is to make a gender balance a little bit. Today, I'm going to talk about the three things. One is to start with the linkage with the World Tsunami Awareness Day related event, including the Tsunami Museum Conference we held twice in Japan. And the second part is to linkage with the Sendai framework some speaker already mentioned. Then the third one is to talk about the preservation of the cultural heritage, those activities in Japan. Those three topics I'm going to cover. First, the World Tsunami Awareness Day event. This World Tsunami Awareness Day was set by the UN, the General Assembly in 2015, and decided to have this to raise awareness on the tsunami risk and enhance the tsunami countermeasures. Then this resolution, led by the UNDRR, the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, it's called now, is collaborating with several United Nations agencies and so on. And this November 5th is an event in Japan. The Nankai trough earthquake caused the big tsunamis and earthquakes 150 some years ago, the 1854, I believe. So that's commemorating on that day, the huge impacts, and that would happen again in the Western Japan in the near future. So we need to prepare for that big disaster. So this commemorating day of that. Then first World Tsunami Museum Conference was held in 2017, then participated by the several museums, tsunami-related museums from the, mainly from Asia, but from the world. Then the purpose is to preserve records and tsunami damage and the museum roles, and important role of museum to share experience, lessons learned, pass records for the future generations and other countries, then discuss the importance and the roles of the museums from the those museums from the world. Then this was held in Okinawa Prefecture in Ishigaki Island. Then the location we decided was because it's not only the museum, but the importance is naturally you can see the third bottom of the photo. This is a tsunami rocks, a boulder. It's naturally moved from the sea to the raised to the land by the force of tsunami. So there are some locations, natural locations, monument kind of things outside of the museums. So we made a tour for those areas. So this Okinawa meeting, the first meeting, was organized by the UN DRR, ICR, then Japanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and JIC, so on. Then the first meeting was to share the information, what each museum and tsunami-related museum has been doing. Actually, there are many disaster-related museums nowadays coming up, not only in these museums I'm going to talk about, but Thailand is making a one tsunami museum, related museum, maybe next year it'll be open. Then Chile is also building the tsunami museum. So there are many interests in these days for making a museum. But then how the terror of the tsunami have been passed down to the future generation? Field museums, as mentioned, the photo, the database for passing down the records of future generations and roles of museums, and created a soft network. So I have been into this disaster-related disaster restoration communities, but there was very few movement of talking about this museum perspectives. So this was very new. These are the museums participated into the 2017 conference. Or the Aceh Museum, Tsunami Museum from Indonesia. The Museum of Lisbon is not entirely talking about the tsunami, but the tsunami exhibition is there. And so many museums from the world. The second one we had last year was held in Tokyo, hosted by this National Museum of Tokyo. Then again, the organizers are similar. Then these number of people participated again. Then some of the new museums, not only Tsunami Museum, but the China, represented by the Wencheng Earthquake Museum and so on. And we talked about after the two meetings, first year and second year. Actually, the last year, we presented outcomes to the ICOM, Asia Pacific ICOM, hosted by the Kyushu National Museum. So we appreciated that. And so I just make a summary and discussions for the future conclusions for our tsunami-related museums activities. The one is to mention about the investment in disaster restoration. I'm going to talk about the Sendai framework linkage, but the Sendai framework for disaster restoration, I just wanted to think how many of you are familiar, how many of you have heard about this Sendai framework for disaster restoration? Anybody? Yes, maybe not very, very common, but yes, this is an important framework decided by the United Nations again. In one word, the Sendai framework is to enhance the pre-disaster activity, disaster risk reduction, rather than disaster management. So we need to prepare for the disaster, prevent, mitigate, those are the importance of those, rather than activities after disaster happens. That is the importance of the Sendai framework, and it's investment in disaster restoration. That's a key word for the Sendai. Then second one is to educate youth and children. These were almost every museum participants mentioned about the importance of the education and the youth and children. Then creating a soft network of Tsunami Museum. Then location of the museum is important. for avoiding the hazard risky area. The museum has to have the role of a connector because we in the university or government or the UN have a conference and then talking about the disaster. Sometimes it's a bit, the venue is not so easily accessed, but for the museum, or everybody can go. Every citizen who are interested can go. Very easy access to, so it's a good location to learn about the disaster of the education and public awareness. So that is a very good connector. Then and the next one is the preservation and the exhibition of each object, as mentioned. Then the framework, Sendai framework, next one. Then heritage networks and those Blue Sheet International, those activities were mentioned and then picked up. Then rescue of cultural heritage was also mentioned. The international, interaction between disasters and culture in history is important. Then the connection with ICOM and UNESCO was also mentioned during this meeting. The linkage with the Sendai framework. So the Sendai framework, there are 3 international agreements on disaster risk reduction in the past. 1994 in Yokohama Plan of Action, then 2005 Hyogo Framework of Action. This Sendai is the 3rd one in the UN conference adopted the framework. Then all trying to make importance of the disaster risk reduction, not after disaster, but before disaster to do things better. Then Sendai, what was new in Sendai was to set up the targets, the 7 global targets. This is associated with SDGs. And SDGs has clear goals and targets. Then also the Sendai made goals and targets. And there are 7 global targets. Then the number C, the number 3, the C, reducing the economic losses by disaster. Within this C, there are several subcategories with indicators. And last C6 is mentioning about our topic, the direct economic loss to cultural heritage damaged or destroyed attributed to disasters. So it's not easy to value the data mark putting on the damaged items, but at least it was mentioned, included in this topic. Then that was perhaps because of some of the groups, like this resilient cultural heritage meeting was held during the Sendai meeting. So those activities were fed into the development of the Sendai framework. So I just wanted to pick up on some of the meetings which was taking into consideration of the Sendai framework. Then next topic is to talk about the national activities of the task force of the Japanese Cultural Heritage Disaster Risk Mitigation Network. This was established already in July 2014, before the Sendai was established. So their mission is to, one, the system development, research and survey, and human resource development. So it started with the task force and executive committee established and so on. This network is very working fantastically. Then the National Historical Materials Network is called ShiryoNet, and the Research Exchange Conference has been held a few times. Then the ShiryoNet networking is spreading now 17 groups, many based on the universities, and spreading to the many other places, including the Miyagi Prefecture, coming from the Sendai area. Then a total of 6,000 more participants enjoying the cultural property rescue project under this Office Agency of Cultural Affairs. Then government-sponsored activities took place more than 40 locations around Miyagi Prefecture, then including the NGOs of more locations. Then their activities are basically 3 things: rescue things after the disaster, or the preservation, then also awareness activities. And we have a few people from ShiryoNet from Tohoku University. If you have any questions, maybe can you stand up, Sato Sensei and others, Kawachi Sensei and other people? So if you have any questions, ShiryoNet, please ask them. Then some recommendations that we wanted to have the development further linkage between the World Tsunami Museum Conference, ICOM, and UNESCO. So I'd like to follow up on that. Then ICOM to initiate the activity to implement the Sendai framework for disaster resolution, then to save cultural and historical assets from disasters. So I understand now that you have a group of activities, and we want to raise this voice to make it more and connect with us, our activities in disaster resolution communities. Then soft network. We are going to make a soft network. We have been building it, But together, not only just the World Tsunami Museum Conference Group, but together with ICOM and UNESCO and international communities. Then World Bonsai Forum. This is World Bonsai. The bonsai is not the bonsai, you might think of it. But this World Bonsai Forum, bonsai in Japanese is disaster risk reduction. We are establishing this forum in Sendai, Japan, where the Sendai framework was decided. The International Research Institute of Disaster Science at Tohoku University, we are also trying to help this making bridge between ICOM and UNESCO and UNDRR and the World Tsunami Awareness Museum Conference. My last slide is the propaganda. In Sendai, we decided to make the World Bonsai Forum every 2 years. So this year, this Bonsai Forum will be held in November in two months in Sendai. We wanted to share various concrete solutions for the disaster risk reduction. Then I think this role of a museum is so important. So not maybe this meeting, but in future meetings, we want to have some collaboration with ICOM and this disaster risk reduction community and this international community on these museums. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much to all of our panelists. What a wonderful set of presentations. Now I'd really like to turn to a little bit of discussion time. We have about 15 minutes left. And my hope is that I can open my phone and get my questions. So we're so reliant on technology. It's not a good thing, right? We should be using paper and pencil, all of us. So one question that I have for the panel, and then I think based on time we may turn it over to the audience questions, but it's been my experience, and I think some of you also working on cultural heritage disaster response, that we're often greeted with skepticism and disbelief by emergency responders that anything can be done or should be done about cultural heritage during the disaster response phase. Based on your individual experiences, how can we better persuade the emergency management and disaster planners of the world to prepare to include cultural heritage professionals in local, national, and international disaster response, rather than waiting for the transition to recovery when it might already be too late? So we'll start with Renata, just to answer that question.
Okay, thank you. I guess communication is key to answer these questions, and I would say in two perspectives. First, we must think that different people must be addressed differently. We tend to offer the same words, the same speech to different people. And the second point would be we tend to be too technical. Once we talk with agents, authorities, we need some more narrative, we need some more stories, and that's the way to engage. And so, talking from my public sector perspective, I guess that's the key to answer that.
Alejandra, what are your thoughts?
It's definitely something that I did encounter with my experience after the hurricane. I think this is a discussion that has to be taken to another level, maybe with the government, and probably if we agree with a definition of museum that portrays better the involvement that we have with our community, that could definitely help. I also think that it's easier in a smaller community because you have stronger links to the people that are somehow involved in that recovery, and they do understand the importance of museums and the memory and the heritage that they would hold. But I think it definitely is a problem, and some that I encountered when I was trying to get diesel for the museum, definitely. And the only way I could get it is because there was a personal relationship with a person who was the diesel mogul of the south of Puerto Rico. So, yeah.
Thank you. Aparna?
Yeah, okay, I'm glad that you asked that question, and perhaps it was not clear in my talk in the 7 minutes, and I was rushing through. This has been one of the mainstay of the work that ICOM has recently been doing, is this familiarity between cultural heritage professionals and wider disaster risk management professions, emergency managers, civil defense. And what has been our experience is that it's not that they don't understand, it is just that we have to learn to speak their language, and we also have to standardize approaches. Yesterday was very good, museum definition. We need to have these kind of debates. But emergency is not the time to get into big debates over terminology, over things. There are only some standard responses you can give to tangible and intangible heritage in a large-scale emergency. So we have to get our act together and standardize our methods and approaches. Also, the conversations have to happen before. The coordination has to happen before. And our sector has the thinking that we can be a closed-up sector and still work in a wide-scale emergency. That's not going to work at all. The spaces that you count on, as your experience yourself, the simple things of life, supply chains, you do not have access to them. So you have to work with your local emergency managers, and you have to get to know them. They will not come knocking on your door, because right now heritage is not included, despite Sendai, in the local disaster risk governance. So it's the local disaster risk governance that has to be improved. And if we want to really embrace the spirit and the mission or the vision that has been outlined in the museum definition, then we have to go out and do it proactively. They will not come and take over the sector, burden of the sector, when they are already, the humanitarian response systems are overstretched. And we know, as I tried to outline, it's about coping capacities. Last year, it was Maria and other, and now it is Dorian. So the story is, and same here in Japan. So we are stretching our system to the limit, and we have to contribute proactively. That's my feeling.
Yeah. Professor Ono?
Yes. So I'm just following up on the last speaker on the importance of this Sendai framework or this international framework. Take advantage of that, or SDGs. Mentioning about disaster risk reduction, and this needs to be downscaled to the local level. And the Sendai frameworks, one of the 7 goals is the limit is next year. It's actually this mentioning about enhancing the local capacity, local government capacity in disaster risk reduction. So that's a good timing. And also the exchange of the information. For example, I think Kyoto has 1,000 years of history and lots of cultural heritage. Still, some of the buildings are standing. That had to go through the many disasters, fires, earthquakes, and so on, but still remaining. So that must be maintained by some good policies. So just learning this exchange of this information through the ICOM and the other countries to share. That may be another way to do that. Thank you.
So I'd like to go ahead and open it up to the floor. I think Renata has a colleague that she would first like to call upon out in the audience. And then if you have a question, please come up to the microphone nearest your seat that are in the aisles.
Thank you, Corinne. As I mentioned in my presentation, Mr. Paulo Amaral, the president of the Brazilian Institute of Museums, which is the most high authority in the museum field in Brazil, is here. So maybe he could talk a little bit, give a brief comment on the current situation after the Museum National Fire. I don't know if there is a mic there.
There's a microphone right behind you. There's a microphone right behind you in the aisle. No.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for this invitation. It's a pleasure to attend this ICOM General Conference and share with you some aspects of our work in order to minimize risks of Brazilian museums. It's important to remark that the museum sector in Brazil is a vast and diverse one. We have a universe of 3,700 museums preserving around 70 million cultural items. It's a sector employing more than 29,000 professionals and receiving around 29 million visitors a year. In Brazil, most museums are public institutions depending on federal, state, or municipal administrations. About 24 of these museums are private. The Brazilian Institute of Museums, or IBRAM, which I represent here, is the government agency in charge of policies and guidelines for the development of the museum sector in Brazil. In our capacity, we advise museums, promote capacity building activities, and support the implementation of several initiatives regarding risk management, educational activities, and sustainability. Our mission, however, is twofold. Besides public policies for the museum sector, IBRAM also manages 30 federal museums through Brazil. One of our main tasks in the implementation of the risk management program for Brazilian museums heritage, which encompasses a range of activities aimed at establishing guidelines, exchanging information, and advising museums for better risk control and mitigation. Since the advent in the National Museum, IBRAM and many Brazilian institutions have been working together in order to help the National Museum to recover and to avoid such a disaster to even happen again. Our main concern is to mitigate or eradicate risks, and a working group is currently reassessing museums in order to identify possible vulnerabilities and tackle them. It's crucial that the maintenance of museum facilities be present in the core of any risk management policy. No maintenance is almost all times the mother of disasters. Today, many museums and IBRAM's administrations are under renovation thanks to financial resources, and that's very important to say, provided by the National Culture Plan, the National Development Bank, and the Ministry of Justice Diffuse Rights Fund. IBRAM also signed a technical cooperation protocol with the National Museum to provide technical advice to the reconstruction of the museum, to its collection management, and the promotion of partnerships. This is a huge and urgent challenge, and we are keen to cooperate with global partners in order to achieve these goals. In June this year, together with ICOM and ICOM, we organized this international seminar in Rio de Janeiro called Heritage on Fire to address this recurring risk and how to protect our cultural institutions from it. Most of you, I imagine, have seen that play, that Broadway play, The Phantom of the Opera. And there's a moment when the Phantom says to Christine, because she doesn't accept her, she doesn't decide herself about his love, and he says to her, a disaster beyond your imagination will occur. This is a very strong sentence. And I think when I remember of this, I remember of our museums. If we don't decide to take care of our museums, disasters beyond our imagination can occur. Thank you very much.
Do we have any questions from the floor? Just see one up here.
It's not so much a question as a comment. So I'm Henry McGee from Curating Tomorrow in the UK. And what I'm interested in, what a number of us are interested in, is how we use museums as capacity builders in relation to climate change. So I was involved in how we got museums to feature in the work plan for the Paris Agreement last year. And so with a colleague, Sarah Sutton, and I, and a few others, we're aiming to run some events in Santiago with the COP in December, both in local museums to build awareness and capacity amongst museum workers there, but also we'll be sending out an invitation soon for case studies for how we all contribute to the various elements of something called the Doha Work Programme, which is around public education, access to information, training, public participation, international cooperation, and one other that I can't remember off the top of my head. So I just wanted to point that out. We'll be asking people soon, and it's very fantastic to hear some of your presentations. Thank you.
I think we have time for one more question, if anybody is inclined. Okay, well then, thanks very much. Oh, wait, did I see somebody? Okay, oh, please do. Please do.
Thank you very much for raising the UK participant, this Paris Agreement and SDGs and Sendai. Those three international agenda and decided in 2015, so important. But as we know, that sometimes people feel that's so high up and it's apart from our daily activities. So it's like the museums or school education, those are a very good arena to interact, this exchange information. So I have a high expectation for the museums to do such education and public awareness activities on this international agenda. Thank you.
So I think, yes, museums have a great potential, and I also mentioned that we recently conducted some risk mapping exercises in winemaking district of Georgia, where we worked with the local community, and indeed it is again about working with the local people and your city and working and trying to find out how people used to cope with extreme events and what has changed now, and then trying to educate at that level and not, thinking about big concepts, but thinking about consumption at local levels, supply chains, what can grow more locally, what is more sustainable, and demystifying the whole concept of climate change adaptation. And I think if our one takeaway is that action has to be local, not,
Yeah, and I think action has to be local, and for those of you in museum leadership, the message that disaster risk reduction and management matters to you, that message down to your staff, I think can go a long way also in helping us do our work. So again, can we thank our panelists again today? Thanks very much to ICOM for having this important session, and to our Japanese hosts. And I encourage you to seek out our panelists during the breaks and during other sessions and chat with them about your own concerns. Thanks very much, everyone.